The Senate chamber was tense, cameras were rolling, reporters leaned in ready to capture what was expected to be a routine hearing. But then, Pam Bondi and John Kennedy took the floor, and within minutes, Attorney General Merrick Garland went from calm and collected to completely stunned. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Garland had walked into the hearing prepared to defend his record. He had talking points, pre-written statements, and a media narrative already in place, but nothing could prepare him for what was about to unfold. Pam Bondi wasted no time, launching into a brutal line of questioning that cut straight through the usual political spin. And just when Garland thought he could regain control, John Kennedy stepped in, his signature bluntness turning the pressure up even higher. And then, the moment no one expected, Garland froze. The Attorney General, a man who had spent years navigating the political battlefield, suddenly had nothing to say. The hearing room fell silent. Even the reporters in the back exchanged glances. This was not the way this was supposed to play out. What did Bondi and Kennedy ask that left Garland completely speechless? And more importantly, why was he so afraid to answer? Stay tuned. Because this wasn't just another hearing. This was a moment that changed everything. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were hot, and the nation was watching. Attorney General Merrick Garland sat at the witness table, hands folded, prepared to deliver his carefully crafted responses. It was supposed to be just another hearing, another day of political back and forth. But this time something was different. Pam Bondi and John Kennedy were not there for the usual political pleasantries. They weren't interested in scripted answers or vague statements. They were there for accountability, and Garland knew it. As the hearing began, the room was calm, at least on the surface. Senators took turns questioning Garland, sticking to routine matters. But when Pam Bondi's turn came, the atmosphere shifted. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Garland. The usual political niceties were gone. She didn't waste time on formalities. She was there to get answers. "Mr. Attorney General," she began, her voice steady but firm, "you've repeatedly stated that the Department of Justice operates without political bias. But the American people are seeing something very different." Garland sat still, expression neutral. But there was a flicker, a moment of hesitation. He knew where this was going. Then, before he could respond, John Kennedy cut in. His voice carried across the room, unmistakable in its southern bluntness. "General Garland, do you believe in enforcing the law equally or just when it's convenient for your political allies?" Garland blinked. He wasn't expecting to be hit from both sides. The room grew noticeably quieter. Senators stopped shuffling their papers. The reporters in the back of the chamber leaned forward. This was no longer a routine hearing. Pam Bondi and John Kennedy had just changed the tone completely. And for the first time that day, Merrick Garland looked uncomfortable. Pam Bondi wasn't one for theatrics. She let the facts do the talking. And right now all eyes were on her. She adjusted her papers, took a measured breath, and then went straight for the jugular. "Mr. Attorney General, let's talk about equal justice under the law." Garland sat up straighter. The tension in the room thickened. Bondi didn't wait for him to respond. "You've repeatedly claimed that your department is unbiased. But tell me, why does it seem that certain individuals and groups are given a pass while others are investigated relentlessly?" Garland blinked. He opened his mouth slightly, but Bondi wasn't finished. "Americans are watching. They see the cases your department prioritizes and the ones it ignores. They see the difference in how certain political figures are treated compared to others, and they want answers." Garland shifted in his seat. His usual composed demeanor was cracking, just a little. Bondi pressed on. "Is the Department of Justice truly committed to enforcing the law fairly? Or is this just about protecting the right people and targeting the wrong ones?" A murmur rippled through the room. Reporters tapped furiously on their keyboards. This was getting serious. Garland cleared his throat, gripping the table slightly. But before he could even begin to formulate an answer, John Kennedy jumped in. And that's when things really got interesting. If Garland thought he had a moment to compose himself, he was mistaken. Before he could even take a breath, John Kennedy leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. Attorney General, I gotta ask, is it just me, or do y'all only seem to enforce the law when it's politically convenient?" The room tensed. Reporters exchanged glances. Staffers shifted in their seats. Garland's lips tightened. He reached for his water glass, taking a slow sip, buying time. But Kennedy wasn't about to let him off the hook. Let's not dance around this. We've seen prosecutions move at lightning speed when they benefit your side of the aisle. And yet, when we're talking about people who just so happen to be politically aligned with y'all, suddenly the system slows to a crawl. Garland finally spoke, his voice measured. That is not accurate, Senator. Kennedy raised an eyebrow, almost amused. Oh? So, you're telling me it's just a coincidence? You're telling me that Americans who see the double standard playing out in real time, they're all just imagining it? Garland hesitated. Bondi folded her arms, waiting. Kennedy pressed on. Tell me, Mr. Attorney General, how many politically sensitive cases have you conveniently declined to investigate? How many whistleblowers have come forward exposing bias in your department only to be ignored? Garland shifted uncomfortably. Kennedy didn't stop. And why is it that certain high-profile figures seem to escape consequences altogether, while others get dragged through the mud for far less? The room was dead silent. Garland's hands tightened on the table. He was searching for an answer, any answer, but before he could even formulate a response, Pam Bondi delivered the knockout blow. For a moment, Merrick Garland just sat there. The weight of the questions had landed, the cameras were rolling, every eye in the room was locked onto him, and for the first time in the hearing, he had no immediate response. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He reached for his water glass again, taking another slow sip, but this time it wasn't to clear his throat. It was to buy time. Pam Bondi and John Kennedy didn't blink. They sat perfectly still, waiting. The silence stretched. Then, finally, Garland cleared his throat. Senator Kennedy, as I've stated before, the Department of Justice operates without bias and follows the rule of law. Kennedy leaned back slightly, shaking his head. Oh, come on now, General, that's what you're going with? Bondi took the opening. Mr. Attorney General, with all due respect, that's not an answer. It's a talking point. Garland stiffened. Bondi pressed on. Do you deny that politically motivated cases are handled differently in your department? Garland hesitated. He paused again. A few reporters at the back of the room exchanged quick glances. They could see it. Garland was off balance. Kennedy smirked. I'll take that as a no. The moment was palpable. The Attorney General of the United States, one of the most powerful legal figures in the country, was on defense. Bondi let the silence linger for just a second longer, then delivered the final blow. If you truly stand by your department's actions, you'd have no problem answering directly. So let me ask again, why are politically inconvenient cases ignored while others are pursued relentlessly? Garland looked down at his notes. He had nothing. The room remained frozen, waiting for a response that wasn't coming. And then, the floodgates opened. Reporters began whispering. Key staffers exchanged nervous looks. This was not how this hearing was supposed to go. Garland had come prepared for a controlled discussion. He had not come prepared for this. And before he could even attempt to recover, the hearing took a dramatic turn. For a man who had spent his entire career navigating the complexities of the legal system, Merrick Garland was suddenly out of words. The cameras zoomed in. The entire room was watching him, waiting. But instead of responding, Garland sat frozen. Pam Bondi let the silence stretch. She wasn't going to bail him out. John Kennedy raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly forward. Cat got your tongue, General? A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. Garland shifted, clearly uncomfortable. Bondi didn't flinch. She knew this was the moment. You are the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country, she said, her tone unshaken. And yet, when asked a direct question about fairness and equal justice under the law, you have nothing to say? Garland exhaled sharply. He glanced toward his staffers as if hoping for some kind of lifeline, but there was none. The silence was deafening. Then, finally, he tried. I believe that... But before he could finish, Bondi cut in. No, Mr. Attorney General, not what you believe. Just answer the question. Garland's face tightened. He opened his mouth again, then stopped himself. He had nothing. John Kennedy smirked. I think that tells us everything we need to know. At that moment, something changed. It wasn't just that Garland had failed to answer. It was that everyone in the room, every senator, every staffer, every reporter had just witnessed it. Bondi let out a slow breath, glancing toward Kennedy before gathering her papers. She was done. But the damage? It was already done. Reporters in the back scrambled to send messages. The story was writing itself. Garland's failure to respond wasn't just an awkward pause, it was an admission. And before he could even attempt to recover, the internet had already seen everything. The Senate hearing had barely ended before social media erupted. Within minutes, clips of Merrick Garland's speechless reaction were flooding Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. The footage of him fumbling for words, glancing nervously at his notes, and ultimately saying nothing became the internet's new favorite political moment. Trending hashtags took over immediately. Hashtag Garland exposed, hashtag Bondi vs Garland, hashtag Kennedy claps, back, hashtag DOJ double standards. The reaction was brutal. Merrick Garland just got wrecked on live TV. This was hard to watch. If silence speaks volumes, then Garland just admitted everything. Pam Bondi came prepared. Garland came with excuses. That's why he lost. John Kennedy is a national treasure. Cat got your tongue, General? Iconic. Conservative commentators wasted no time jumping in. Fox News aired the clip on repeat under the headline, "Garland stunned after Pam Bondi and John Kennedy corner him. See for yourself." The Daily Wire posted a reaction video. Watch, Garland left speechless in brutal Senate hearing. Ben Shapiro retweeted the moment saying, "Garland got exposed in real time and he knows it." Tucker Carlson called it one of the most embarrassing moments for an attorney general in history. But the real explosion came when Elon Musk joined in. Not a great look for Garland. Seems like he wasn't ready for the truth. That one tweet sent the clip into overdrive, millions of views within hours. Memes flooded the internet. Even people outside of politics were watching. The memes were relentless. When your teacher calls on you and you didn't do the reading. That moment when you realize you just lost the argument. Garland after seeing Pam Bondi's name on the witness list. Meanwhile, liberal media scrambled to contain the damage. CNN tried to downplay the moment, calling it a heated exchange with no real winner. MSNBC claimed Bondi and Kennedy were being unfairly aggressive. The Washington Post ran an op-ed. Garland shows restraint in the face of political theater, but none of it worked, because the raw footage spoke for itself. People weren't reading spin pieces. They were watching the video, and every single time they did, the same thing happened. They saw Pam Bondi and John Kennedy ask direct questions. They saw Garland stumble, hesitate, and fail to answer. And they saw exactly why this moment was going to be remembered. By midday, the clip had over 10 million views. By nightfall, it had passed 25 million. By the end of the week, it was officially one of the most watched Senate hearing moments in history. And Merrick Garland's name would never be the same again. The viral moment had already taken on a life of its own. Millions had watched the clip. The reaction was swift, brutal, and completely out of the media's control, and that's when the damage control operation began. By the next morning, left-leaning news networks were in full crisis mode. Their job, reframe the narrative, downplay the moment, protect Garland at all costs. CNN kicked things off with a headline that immediately set the tone. Garland faces aggressive questioning in contentious Senate hearing. They didn't mention that he had been completely unable to respond. They didn't highlight the fact that Pam Bondi and John Kennedy had exposed major inconsistencies in his statements. Instead, they painted him as the victim. MSNBC followed suit with a panel discussion where commentators quickly dismissed the hearing as a political stunt. This wasn't a real debate. It was an orchestrated attack, one pundit claimed. Bondi and Kennedy weren't asking serious questions, they were performing for social media. Another guest nodded. Garland showed restraint. He refused to engage with bad faith attacks. That's real leadership. The Washington Post ran an op-ed titled, "Garland's silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy." The article argued that his refusal to respond was actually a form of discipline, that by not engaging, he took the high road. But there was just one problem with that argument. Nobody was buying it, because the footage was everywhere, and no amount of carefully worded editorials could erase what people had already seen with their own eyes. Fox News wasted no time firing back. Garland didn't take the high road, he had no road at all. The Daily Wire released a brutal headline. Watch, liberal media tries to spin Garland's humiliation, fails miserably. Conservative commentators tore through the media's attempts to shift the blame. Ben Shapiro posted, "Amazing how the same media that called Trump unhinged for responding to reporters now calls Garland measured for saying nothing." Tucker Carlson went even further. "They're trying to gaslight America into thinking we didn't all see what we just saw." The backlash was overwhelming. For every attempt to soften the damage, there were hundreds of thousands of people reposting the original clip, breaking down Garland's failure in real time. And then, the real panic set in, because even some moderate voices started questioning Garland's leadership. A well-known independent journalist tweeted, "I don't care where you stand politically. If the Attorney General of the United States can't answer a basic question about equal justice, that's a problem." The media had miscalculated. They assumed they could redirect the story, that they could bury it under a pile of op-eds and panel discussions, but they couldn't, because Garland's silence had been too damning. The video was too clear, and as much as they tried to reshape the narrative, the truth was already out there. By the end of the day, mainstream outlets had no choice but to shift their approach. The narrative changed from "Garland handled it well" to "The GOP is exploiting this moment to discredit the DOJ." The spin wasn't working, so they went back to attacking Bondi and Kennedy instead. But at that point, it didn't matter, because the damage was already done, and Garland's reputation, it was never going to recover. The backlash was immediate, and it wasn't slowing down. Garland's team knew they had a disaster on their hands. They had seen the clips. They had read the headlines. They had watched as millions of Americans reacted in real time, mocking Garland's failure to answer even the most basic questions. And now, they had one job: stop the bleeding. Behind closed doors, Garland's advisors scrambled for a strategy. Emails were fired off. Crisis meetings were held. Every political operative in his circle was weighing in on how to control the damage. One camp wanted him to issue a strong public statement, something forceful to push back against the narrative that he had been exposed. Another camp thought the best move was to lay low, ride it out, and let the media handle the spin for him, but there was just one problem. Nothing was working. Every mainstream outlet had already gone all in on trying to protect him, and it wasn't moving the needle. The clips were everywhere. No matter how much the media tried to bury the moment under op-eds and panel discussions, the video kept resurfacing. The silence, the hesitation, the blank stare. No amount of spin could erase that. Garland's team went into full damage control mode. They reached out to allies in the Senate, hoping to shift the conversation. Loyal Democratic lawmakers rushed to Twitter, trying to change the subject. "Republicans are just trying to manufacture outrage," one senator claimed. "This is a non-story. The real issue is GOP obstruction," said another. But the public wasn't buying it. Garland's social media team tried to redirect attention by posting about unrelated DOJ initiatives, but every post was immediately flooded with comments about the hearing. "Answer the question, Garland. You had one job and you failed. No one is letting this go. We saw it. You froze." The meltdown was happening in real time, and then came the worst part. Even some of Garland's usual defenders in the media were struggling to justify what happened. One well-known liberal journalist admitted on air, "Look, let's be honest here. That moment didn't look good for Garland. He should have had a better response." Another panelist reluctantly acknowledged, "If this had been a Republican attorney general, we'd be demanding answers." It was a nightmare scenario for Garland's team because this wasn't just a bad hearing. This was a defining moment. And as the backlash continued, the momentum wasn't slowing down. It was growing. By the next day, polls showed a sharp drop in Garland's approval rating. For the first time, even moderate voters were questioning his leadership. The DOJ's credibility was taking a massive hit. Fox News ran segments all day, emphasizing that Garland's silence had confirmed exactly what Republicans had been saying all along. The Daily Wire posted another breakdown. Garland's team in panic mode as public rejects their excuses. Conservative influencers kept the pressure up. "We're supposed to trust the DOJ when its leader can't even answer basic questions. Garland's team is flailing, and it's embarrassing to watch." And Garland? He stayed silent. He skipped a scheduled public appearance, avoiding reporters altogether. His advisors were desperate to find an angle that worked, but every time they thought they had a way out, another clip of the hearing would go viral again. Another commentator would tear apart his non-answers. Another headline would highlight his failure. The moment was no longer just about Garland. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with the political establishment. The narrative had shifted. The media had lost control, and Garland's reputation it was never going to recover. The moment had passed, but its effects were just beginning. What started as just another routine hearing had turned into a political earthquake. Garland's silence, his hesitation, his inability to defend himself, it all told the American people everything they needed to know. This wasn't just about one bad exchange. This wasn't just about one viral moment. This was about a shift in power, and Garland's team knew it. The fallout came fast. By the next morning, polling data showed a steep decline in Garland's approval rating. Among independent voters, trust in the DOJ hit an all-time low. Among Republicans, Garland had become the ultimate symbol of government corruption. Even some moderate Democrats started questioning whether he was the right person for the job. This wasn't just a bad look for Garland. This was a credibility crisis for the entire Department of Justice. And the media, they were still scrambling. Left-wing outlets kept trying to spin the moment, but it wasn't working. The footage was too damning. The silence was too loud. The internet wasn't letting it go. Conservative media continued piling on the pressure. Fox News ran back-to-back specials. What is Garland hiding? A DOJ under fire. The Daily Wire aired a deep-dive breakdown. Watch. Garland's worst political moment yet. Ben Shapiro laid it out plainly. If this hearing proved anything, it's that Garland isn't in control. The man doesn't even have answers for basic questions. Tucker Carlson didn't hold back either. How do you lead the DOJ when you can't even lead a 5-minute exchange? And the White House? They knew they had a serious problem. Calls started coming in from Democratic strategists and party officials, worried that Garland had become a liability heading into the next election cycle. The conversation had shifted. It was no longer about whether Garland was right or wrong. It was about whether he was even fit to serve. Even some longtime Democratic insiders admitted privately that the moment was a disaster. One high-ranking Democratic staffer, speaking off the record, told a journalist, "There's no getting around it. This was bad, really bad, and we don't have a way to fix it." But the impact didn't stop with Garland. This moment exposed something far bigger. For years, the establishment had controlled the political narrative. They set the rules. They decided who was held accountable. They dictated what stories got covered and which ones got buried. But not anymore. This moment had stripped that illusion away. The American people weren't just watching Garland. They were watching an entire system crumble under its own weight. And the backlash wasn't just political. It was cultural. Voters weren't just questioning Garland. They were questioning the entire media apparatus that tried to protect him. Social media was flooded with comments. This proves what we've known all along. The DOJ is corrupt, and they know it. The media can spin this however they want. The truth is out. This is what happens when you put a weak leader in charge of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. The chatter didn't die down. It grew. By the end of the week, Garland had become a symbol of everything wrong with Washington. Corruption, bureaucracy, lack of accountability. And the worst part? Even his own party knew there was no way to undo the damage. No speech, no op-ed, no carefully crafted statement could erase what millions of people had seen with their own eyes. Garland had walked into that hearing as the Attorney General of the United States. By the time he walked out, his legacy was destroyed, and there was no coming back from it.